Well, there's been a number of media briefings too happening right here in Nasrec. Let's give you a sense then of what the G20 Sherpa Zane Dangor had to say earlier on. He spoke to the media answering a number of questions, as you would imagine, following the adoption of that declaration. Let's listen in.
There was a question about the declaration, and I think one delegation this morning saying that there's elements of that delegation that they may not be happy with. Just to say that this declaration was negotiated in good faith, and with one key member voluntarily absenting themselves from this. We had new dimensions to negotiate, and we did that very well, and through consensus, looking at what does consensus mean. Does it mean everybody in the room or those here present? And you'll see that our declaration talks about the leaders who gathered in Johannesburg. So the consensus talks about all of us who gathered, and that the declaration reflects that consensus after 5 long days of Sherpa negotiations and 2 Sherpas leading various elements of that. So lots of hard work went into it, and the declaration stands. One delegation spoke in the opening session about issues that they have challenges with. And this is exactly what happened, as our president pointed out, in Brazil with the same delegation last year. So the declaration stands just as much as the Brazilian declaration stands. So I think Kolisa, the Sous Sherpa, just spoke about the important work that was done on climate change and that how that influences what happens in other spaces. The point there is that whatever we agree in the G20 is not binding on anybody. The G20 is an informal group. It doesn't bind us. But what it does do is influence how others may want to take things forward. And it allows South Africa, as part of the Africa group in the UN or part of the G77, to take these issues and influence through the ginger analogy that was just made. So the same issue then has been confronted by ourselves. South Africa initiated what is called the G20 at 20 review, which is the first review of the G20 after the first cycle. The next cycle begins next week under the US presidency. And it's important to reflect on how presidencies in an informal grouping is decided upon. So the presidency of the US was decided through negotiations in India, which is 3 years ago, where we then confirmed that the US will take over in 2026. Similarly, we've just decided through negotiations that in 2027 it will be the UK and South Korea in 2028. Our review has indicated that there's a strong agreement that we remain informal, that we remain an informal grouping, and that we don't formalize too many of the rules and procedures that we work on. So on the question, then it also links to the question of how consensus is formed. This is the very first time where we had an unprecedented situation where one member voluntarily absented themselves. And based on that, we had to have a discussion on, in this informal group, how do we define consensus and how do we deal with consensus? And we dealt with that through the very first paragraph that says, those who gathered here. And nobody else other than Argentina who raised the concern. There's overwhelming support for every single paragraph which was negotiated through consensus in that declaration. So I think it's an important point to just make that we remain an informal grouping, and that's our presidency. I decided we cannot set rules about whether absenteeism in one instance disqualifies you from being the president in the next cycle. That may be something that may come up when the implementation of what we initiated gets taken forward by the US, the UK, and South Korea in the next cycle.